My name is Dennis McCann, and this is the very first Wisconsin Historical Society Book Bites event. Normally, we go out and talk about our books in large groups of people, 20 or 40 or 100, and we can't do that these days. So what we're doing is reaching out with our books this way online, and you're welcome to follow along. I think later this evening, you're able to, as we go along, in fact, add comments or questions. We'll see how this all goes. This is the first time that we've done this. It's certainly the first time I've been alone in a room talking about a book. So we'll see how it goes. I'm here to talk about my book, The Wisconsin Story, 150 people, places, and turning points that shaped the Badger State. It was published by the Wisconsin Historical Society last September. This is my fourth book with the Society Press, and I'm really thrilled to be working with them because they do a great job of putting the books out. The truth is that this book is a little older than that, though, because it's legally, it's old enough to vote and to buy a beer legally. I wrote it 22 years ago. Started in 1997. The newspaper I was working for, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, was interested in taking part in the state's sesquicentennial. That's the 150th birthday party. And so the editors were talking about what to do with this. And so they came up with an idea. One idea was to send a reporter down the Wisconsin River in a canoe, writing stories all the way. And I thought, and they said, my name came up first. And I thought, that's wonderful. 430 miles in a canoe with mosquitoes and sunburn and no place for golf clubs. And my name came up. But somehow that idea went away. And instead, they came up with an idea of writing 150 stories about the state of Wisconsin, 150 historical pieces. And again, my name came up, and my editor, Marty Kaiser, said, do you want to be part of this? And I said, I'd rather do the whole thing myself. And so I did. I got a year to immerse myself in Wisconsin history. And it was just a thrill for me. I'd spent a lot of time, a lot of years traveling the state, and so I had a pretty good foundation. But it allowed me to really get deeper into the stories that make Wisconsin what it is. I got to choose the stories that I would do myself. I started out with a list of the obvious suspects, and as time went on, I talked to some people that I valued, people that I trusted their opinions, and came up with a bunch of more stories. And there were certain ones that simply had to be in the book, starting with certain political figures. The first one would be Fighting Bob La Follette, who was the leader of the progressive movement in Wisconsin. He was the first Wisconsin governor who was born in the state. He was born in a log cabin in Dane County, and he went to the University of Wisconsin and eventually served in Congress as a very young man, and then was elected in 1901 as governor. And he served until 1906 when he was elected to the U.S. Senate. But the people that he surrounded himself with came up with some of the programs that became models for the nation, progressive programs. He took on the utilities, the railroads, and things like that, and really tried to represent people. He became a national figure of great renown. I also included a story on his wife, Belle La Follette, who similarly was born in Wisconsin in a cabin in Baraboo. And she attended the University of Wisconsin as well at a really young age, and is the first woman to graduate from the University of Wisconsin Law School. And I believe she graduated from law school before she was able to legally argue before the Supreme Court because she was a woman. But Belle La Follette became a significant figure in her husband's administration. She was an advisor to him. He called her the brainiest member of the family. And she also had her own career. She was a suffragette speaker nationally and became really well renowned and respected. So Belle Case La Follette certainly deserved a chapter. And I wanted to include some of the significant historical figures of Wisconsin in terms of the environment. Gaylord Nelson, who we know today is the father of Earth Day. John Muir, who was one of the main influencers who created the national park system. He was born in Scotland, but came to Wisconsin as a boy. He lived in his farm in southern Wisconsin and attended the University of Wisconsin, where he did not graduate, but he, among other things, created some amazing inventions. And one of them is in the lobby of the Historical Society in Madison. It might be my favorite artifact of all. It's a desk that would wake him up and then turn the books as it moved around. It's just a marvelous thing. So he said that professors would come to his room just to watch this thing operate. And I also included a chapter on Aldo Leopold, who we consider the father of the conservation movement. This was my book, and so I was allowed to pick the chapters that I wanted, so I included a boyhood hero, Henry Aaron. But I didn't write about him in Milwaukee. I wrote about him when he came to Wisconsin in 1952 to play in Eau Claire for the Eau Claire Bears. He was very young. He had never been to the North. He was very nervous because he had never played baseball against white players before. And Eau Claire was all white at that time. He lived at the YMCA. There was a family there who was assigned to be sort of his surrogate family, and they'd help take care of him. At one point, he called home and said he was going to leave and go back to Alabama, and his brother talked him into staying. And it's good that he did, because we all know what happened. And for me, Henry Aaron is still the home run king. I don't care what anybody says. Wisconsin produced a number of figures who became internationally famous. One of them was Golda Meir, who grew up in Milwaukee after she moved to the United States with her family. And she lived on the east side of Milwaukee and went to school there, learned how to speak English, and she was just amazed at a big city life, a big city in Milwaukee. Years later, after she had gone to Israel and become prime minister, she came back to Milwaukee and went to the school that she had attended. And by then it was called Golda Meir School. And the students were almost entirely Black, but they greeted her with Stars of David made out of pipe cleaners and carnations. And they sang to her in Yiddish, and she put tears in her eyes, she said, to go back to that school and see that. I also wanted to write about different eras that meant so much. The timber era, the logging era in Wisconsin, and the iron ore era. It was the ore mining that really sort of created the name of the Badger State, because the miners were said to burrow into the ground like badgers. And those were significant chapters to include as well. But I wanted to write about sort of the quirkier side of Wisconsin in some ways as well. So I included a chapter on the sovereign state of Winnebago. Winnebago is a little town in eastern Wisconsin. And in 1967, Winnebago was left off the Wisconsin highway map. And so the town became very miffed at this. And they had these meetings and decided they would secede from the state of Wisconsin. So they formed the sovereign state of Winnebago. And they had their own flag. They had the dodo bird was their official state bird and things like that. They had a kitchen cabinet because there was one member of the community named Mary Kitchen, so she became part of the cabinet. They had a Navy, which was a boat out on the river. They had an Air Force because one of the guys had a plane he would go up and fly around in. And they had great fun with this. And Warren Knowles was governor at the time. And Warren didn't help things because he said, where is Winnebago anyway? But eventually he apologized to the community. And so they came back into the fold of the state of Wisconsin. And a number of years after that, they were left off the Rand-McNally Atlas, and the Jaycees applied for political asylum to Canada. I just like those sort of offbeat stories that show you have fun. Another one that I included was what we call the uranium heyday in Wisconsin. This was in the 1950s, and there was a fellow from Lone Rock whose name was Kenneth Crook, which was only a coincidence. But Mr. Crook went to Arizona, and he had a number of health ills. And he sat in a mine, a uranium mine in Arizona. And it was his decided opinion that this low-grade radioactivity helped his physical condition. So he and his wife packed 2,100 pounds of uranium into their car, drove it back to Lone Rock. And he had what he called his uranium tunnel. He had all of this rock hanging in bags on the walls. And he would charge people to go in, $10 for an hour sitting. And neighbors and friends came along. There's a wonderful photograph in the book that shows these people, 1950s housewives, sitting there with their purses on their laps, just absorbing the radioactivity. And at one point, he was getting almost 200 people a day to come to sit in his uranium tunnel. So he was doing fabulous. And state health authorities disagreed and finally shut him down. But there was a little bit of a craze where other people had uranium. There was a tavern in Madison that had a uranium room and a few other places. And after he closed down his uranium tunnel, a chiropractor took over and used it as his waiting room so that he could still get some benefits from it. Closer to home, my home is in Bayfield. So as I look out my window, I'm looking at Madeline Island, where the Ojibwe people have their longtime home. Chief Buffalo, in his 90s, went to Washington, D.C. to lobby the federal government to not remove his people and move them west. Buffalo and a contingent of people went, and somehow they were able to meet with President Millard Fillmore and convince him that they should not be removed. And to this day, they are still residents of northern Wisconsin, not far from here. not on Madeline Island anymore, but they did not have to leave their homeland. And that's a great story. Just to show how things were different then compared to now, I did a story on Calvin Coolidge. His last year as President of the United States, it was his lame duck season, and he didn't really feel like doing much. He decided he would come to Wisconsin and spend the summer fishing for the most part. So he borrowed a home on Cedar Island on the Brule River and set up, and he stayed 88 days in northern Wisconsin. They moved the summer White House to Superior, and they had used Superior Central High School. They put in new communications equipment, and they improved some of the roads, and there was Secret Service, not at the level you'd find today. And he fished much of the time for 88 days. He did not go to the convention where his successor was chosen. He was done with being president, so he spent it up here. Silent Cal had a wonderful time fishing the Brule, and the Brule has remembered him to this day. Some of my other favorite stories, I included one on John Dillinger and the shootout at Little Bohemia at Manitowish Waters. This was in 1934, and Dillinger and his gang were on the run. They weren't really hiding out. They checked into the resort and they were staying there, even as the federal authorities were looking for him. Babyface Nelson was there, and Jake Homer Van Meter, Homer Van Meter was one of his other members of the gang. They were having dinner on Sunday night. It was the chicken special dinner at the Little Bohemia Resort. But the feds had been tipped off that they were there, so they flew a bunch of agents to the Rhinelander Airport and drove in a hurry over to the resort and surrounded the restaurant. And there was an unfortunate incident because a CCC worker decided at the wrong time that he would leave. He had dinner, walked out on the steps, and he was mistaken for a member of the gang. And in the chaos that ensued, he was shot and killed, which alerted the gang that the feds were outside. They got out the windows in the back and all escaped. It was a messy situation. There was a shootout at a nearby place where Homer Van Meter, Babyface Nelson shot one of the federal agents and killed him. This was not very long before Dillinger was turned in by the woman in red in Chicago, which was a very famous thing. But they almost got him here. Didn't work out the way that he thought. I wrote about Abe the Eagle, the Civil War Eagle. He was the symbol of certain troops in the Civil War. He was taken from Wisconsin with the troops, and he would fly over the battlefield. And he was just such an inspiring figure that the Confederates were said to have aimed at him and tried to get him. They were unable to kill him. He eventually came back to Wisconsin, and he was revered for his service, and he lived in the Capitol. The Capitol had a fire, and Abe the Eagle burned, unfortunately. If you go to the Capitol these days in the Assembly, there is a replica Abe the Eagle behind the Assembly Speaker's office, behind the Assembly Speaker's desk. But sometimes there'll be a plastic egg there that someone will put in. But it's just one of those great symbols for Wisconsin. I wrote about the angel in snowshoes, the doctor from Woodruff who would travel on snowshoes to deliver babies and things like that. And I wrote about Harry Houdini. Harry Houdini grew up in Appleton, where his father was a rabbi. And he became a magician there and went on, of course, to international fame. But he spent a lot of time in Wisconsin. He would return and do shows. And there was a great exhibit of him just recently at the Jewish Museum in Milwaukee that told the wonderful story of his life. I'm going to read the shortest story in the book, which just happens to be one of my favorites as well. Just to give you a flavor of what's in here. I mentioned that I wanted to do offbeat stories, and this is one of them. It's called High on Milk, the Saga of Elm Farm Ollie. Among the many notable firsts recorded by Wisconsin natives, this feat might not make the top 10, but it was a high achievement nonetheless. It occurred on February 18, 1930, when dairy interests found an eye-catching way to promote milk at the St. Louis International Air Exposition. As the proud, if partisan, Milwaukee Journal reported on the front page, Ellsworth W. Bunce, former journal carrier and graduate of West Division High School, has the distinction of being the first man to milk a cow in an airplane flight. It was, of course, a first for cows as well. Her name was Elm Farm Ollie, a Guernsey whose nickname became Sky Queen after her historic flight. Accompanied by reporters, her mission was to blaze a trail for the transportation of livestock by air, said a St. Louis newspaper, by allowing scientists to observe the effects of flight on her demeanor and milk production. Elm Farm Ollie was fed and milked during the 72-mile flight from Bismarck, Missouri to St. Louis. Her milk was sealed in paper containers and dropped over the city of St. Louis. Ollie's stunt proved to be so popular that a large crowd, apparently thirsty for milk, gathered on the field where her plane was to land, forcing it to be diverted. Bunce was chosen for the airborne breakthrough not for his paper-carrying skills, but because he worked for the American Guernsey Cattle Club. The flying cow's singular achievement is still celebrated by a small group of Madison residents who belong to the Elm Farm Ollie fan club, which once commissioned an operetta about the event. They called it Muccini's Madame Butterfat. I had a great time doing this book. As I say, I really enjoyed Wisconsin history, and I really relished the idea of spending a year immersed in it. And the other thing about it was that by publishing it as a book after the 150 stories appeared in the newspaper, I had something kind of permanent in my hands. You know, as a newspaper man, everything that I ever wrote was recycled the next day. I'd go for a run in the morning and I'd go past the newspaper that held the column that I was just so proud of, and it's sitting at the curb in the rain. And I thought that something more permanent like this was really something that I wanted to do. And so I was really grateful after this came out on the day of the sesquicentennial in Madison. And I had much of the year that followed to travel around and promote it. So I went all over the state giving talks about this. Had a wonderful time and learned even more about the state in the process. And then after it sold out, that process just seemed over. And a couple of years ago, the then director of the Wisconsin Historical Society Press was in Bayfield at my house. And my wife actually mentioned this book, and Kathy wasn't familiar with it, so I got her a copy. And the society just decided they would put out the new edition, which thrilled me very much. So I'm out giving the same talk that I gave 22 years ago and enjoying it just as much. It hasn't been a good year for giving talks. I had to cancel a lot of them. So it's a great opportunity tonight to get on here and do it this way. So thank you for coming along, and have a good evening.